Ah, my dear listeners, gather around the fire, sit comfortably, and feel the gentle breeze from ancient times. Now we're about to embark on a journey into the depths of history. But this isn't just any journey. Today we'll dive into a story that lasted a full century, where swords clashed, banners fluttered in the wind, and kings, queens, princes, and nobles fought with ambition, power, and honor. The 100 Years' War. Have you heard this name before? Perhaps it whispered in your ear while you were looking at a painting in the shadow of a wall or turning the pages of a book. But I'm here to tell you so much more. Because this is not just a war, it's the story of a nation's fate, the rise and fall of a kingdom, and the suffering and victories of its people. Who could have known at the start that the claims of two countries to the throne would turn into such a long conflict? Imagine a war that lasted a century, so deep and merciless it spanned generations, and ultimately powerful enough to change the course of history. Today we are here to listen to this grand tale. The steel of swords, the sound of battle horns, and the haughty laughter of nobles. We will relive it all. We'll see how human ambitions, desires, and fears turned into a colossal chaos, darkening the lives of people while also creating new opportunities. We'll close our eyes and imagine. We'll feel ourselves in that era. Here we go. Close your eyes, imagine, and listen. Because now the curtain is rising on the 100 Years' War. Ah, yes. Now let's turn back to the complex and turbulent days before the 100 Years' War began. Centuries ago, amidst the shadows wandering through the heart of Europe, we find ourselves in an era where ambition and desire echoed in every corner. At that time, Europe resembled a grand chessboard, but the pieces on that board were not just kings and queens, but also dukes, barons, and bishops. As a sage, let me tell you, Europe's political map back then was much more fragmented than what we see today. Intertwined kingdoms, principalities, and duchies. Each one was engaged in its own power struggle. In the midst of this struggle stood two great giants, France and England. These two kingdoms were destined to face each other on the endless stage of history, throwing their people and lands into the grip of a great war. But my friends, it wasn't just the king's throne disputes that ignited this storm. No. At that time, Europe was on the brink of a major transformation. The social structure was changing, old habits were being questioned, and new ideas were taking root. The dark shadow of the Black Death had only recently lifted. Villages and towns where empty lands were unplowed, and the cold breath of death was felt in the stone streets of cities. In such a period, people lived with both fear and hope. The King of France, the young and ambitious Charles VI, would be known as the Mad King even when he first ascended the throne. Voices of internal strife echoed throughout his kingdom. Powerful nobles refused to recognize the king's authority, acting almost as independent rulers on their own lands. In such an environment, France's weak government structure appeared to be an unmissable opportunity for England. England. The England of that time presented a much different picture compared to France. King Edward III claimed the French throne. The English held the region of Aquitaine in southwestern France, which further escalated the existing tensions between the two countries. The Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, and the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula were all intervening in this political chaos according to their own interests. And let's not forget, Europe was also experiencing an economic transformation. Trade routes were changing, cities were growing, and the bourgeoisie was rising. The old feudal order was being shaken, landowners were facing uprisings from peasants and workers. In this atmosphere, the rumblings of a great war could be heard. On one hand, diplomatic tables were being set, while on the other, armies were being secretly prepared. The fears and hopes of the people were intertwined, and all of Europe was in great turmoil. Yes, my dear friends, the stage for the 100 Years' War was set in this chaos and uncertainty. And in this land, a great story that would shape a generation's life was inevitably being written. Are you ready? Now, amidst this confusion and chaos, we will continue to see how kingdoms and thrones were shaken and lose ourselves in the depths of history. Yes. Now let's take a closer look at the ancient tensions between England and France, the endless struggle between these two great kingdoms. In fact, this enmity was not new, it was the legacy of centuries-old anger and rivalry. First, let me tell you about a historical animosity that had existed for centuries and had become deeply rooted between these two countries. Dear friends, it all began in 1066 with the Norman conquest of England. When William conquered England, he was also the Duke of Normandy, meaning he controlled vast lands in French territory. For the French king at that time, this was both a threat and a source of shame. Another kingdom's ruler, was on his own land. This situation created a never-ending spark between the two countries' rulers, fostering constant rivalry and distrust. For centuries, England and France challenged each other repeatedly. Even during the Crusades, they preferred to undermine each other rather than collaborate. Both kingdoms were burning with the desire to become the most powerful ruler in Europe. And of course, behind all these conflicts were territorial disputes. Land. The most crucial factor in determining a king's power and wealth during the Middle Ages. You see, dear listeners, the region of Aquitaine in southwestern France was held by England, and this land was like a dagger in France's heart. It was valuable both economically and strategically. The King of France dreamed of reclaiming this land, because the fertile lands and developed trade routes of Aquitaine would boost France's economic power and reduce England's influence on the continent. But it wasn't just the land that fueled the tension between these two countries. There were also monarchical claims. In 1328, with the death of King Charles IV of France, the male line of the Capetian dynasty ended. There was no male heir to the throne. At that moment, King Edward III of England emerged and claimed the French throne. Edward III's mother was from the French royal family. However, France invoked the Salic law, which rejected the succession of women and their descendants to the throne. This marked the beginning of a period where diplomacy and political games became much more complex. While France aimed to drive England completely from its lands, England sought to exploit France's weaknesses to expand the rights of its own royal dynasty. At this point, both kingdoms' eyes were once again fixed on the grand chessboard of Europe. England didn't hesitate to interfere in France's internal affairs. France tried to attract England's European allies to its side. Amidst these historical tensions, the peoples of the two countries also developed deep mistrust toward each other. The French peasants saw the English knight as an enemy who plundered, burned, and destroyed their villages, while the English described the French as arrogant, treacherous, and opportunistic. This enmity even reflected in both countries' songs, stories, and legends. So much so that this anger and hatred were passed down to children through tales. But my friends, this was just the beginning. Even before stepping onto the battlefields, the historical rivalry and enmity between England and France simmered like a lava lake waiting to erupt. Now we'll move on to the next section to explain how these historical tensions turned into a great war and how the fire of the 100 Years' War was kindled. Are you ready? Because the truly exciting part is just beginning. My dear friends. Now let me take you to the darkest and most complex scenes of the throne games. England and France weren't just fighting over land or trade routes, they were fighting for the very thrones themselves. Yes, both kingdoms had their own claims they believed were rightful, and these claims spilled the blood, sweat, and tears of these great nations for centuries. Let's go back to 1328. Remember that France's King Charles IV was on his deathbed. As death's cold breath approached, France's great kingdom was stuck in a crisis. Charles had left no male heir behind. The extinction of the Capetian dynasty's male line was a nightmare for the French aristocracy. Who would take the throne? The French nobles and the church were worried about France's future. In this chaotic situation, King Edward III of England suddenly appeared on the scene. He claimed a right to the throne. His mother, Isabella, was the sister of King Charles IV of France, making Edward III one of the strongest candidates for the French throne. However, the French nobles and legal experts wasted no time in preparing a counter-move. They brought up the French legal tradition known as the Salic Law. According to this law, women and their descendants could not claim the throne. Although the Salic Law was an old Frankish tradition, it seemed like a sacred guardian of the French throne at that time. The French nobility and the church wanted to use this law to invalidate Edward III's claim. It was a challenge, like a spark falling into a powder keg. But wait. This wasn't just about the English king's desire to ascend the throne. There were much bigger stakes and deeper rivalries at play. Edward III's goal wasn't just to take the French crown, he also wanted to expand England's influence on the continent and bring France to its knees. By doing so, England would solidify its power and establish a stronger hold over European trade routes. And of course, the French aristocracy couldn't stay silent about this. France had its own claimants to the throne. One notable figure was Philip VI from the Valois dynasty. He was the cousin of King Charles IV and a prominent figure in France. Therefore, he was a strong candidate accepted by many French nobles. But Philip didn't just want to claim the throne by right, he was determined to preserve France's unity and independence, and to eliminate England's influence over France. If Edward III of England took the French throne, France would fall under English domination, which would be a huge dishonor for the French. This was the fear in the hearts of the French people and nobles. Now picture this: on one side, you have Edward III, young, energetic, and ambitious, fighting to claim France's rich lands based on his mother's lineage. On the other side, you have Philip VI, supported by the French nobility, rejecting England's claim to the throne, and determined to preserve France's independence. This meant that these two rulers were not only fighting for the throne, but also for the honor and future of their nations. As England's claims on France were not being accepted, tensions continued to rise. England searched for allies in different parts of Europe to defend its economic interests, and France further caught France's attention. England's attempts to win over trade centers like Flanders heightened France's nerves. Flanders was of great economic and strategic importance. It was a major market for English wool, and controlling this trade was vital for England. So, my friends, these claims to the throne between the two kings were fueling not only a legal and political struggle, but also a clash of economic interests and national sovereignties. These claims were not just whispered in the palaces and royal advisors' circles, they were talked about in village squares, taverns, knights' oaths, and priests' prayers. Everyone knew that the Great War was on the horizon. England was about to step into the heart of France. France, on the other hand, was preparing to defend itself with all its might. Everyone was waiting for the coming great storm. Ah, my dear friends, that's when it all began. The time had come for the war to truly start, and for these claims to be settled with sword and shield, blood and fire. Now we'll continue to tell how this epic struggle between the two great powers flared up, and how the swords clashed. Get ready, because the excitement is just beginning. Ah, my dear listeners, now we arrive at the most critical point in our story: King Edward III of England's claim to the throne and the inevitable declaration of war that followed. Ah, I remember those days as if they were yesterday. On one side was the young, fiery, and ambitious King Edward III of England, and on the other was the resolute King Philip VI of France. The clash of these two great powers marked a turning point in history. As you know, Edward III was a powerful English king claiming the French throne. Having ascended to the English throne at just 14 years old, Edward had over the years learned to make decisions like a seasoned ruler, becoming a strong leader both diplomatically and militarily. In his youth, he was almost like a puppet in the hands of his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. However, over time, Edward emerged from their shadow and carved his own path. After becoming king, he executed his mother's lover and exiled his mother to a corner of the palace. This bold move was a sign of just how daring and ambitious a leader he was. But Edward's ultimate goal was to claim the French throne. Edward III saw the Kingdom of France as his rightful domain. His great-grandmother was Isabella, the sister of France's last Capetian King Charles IV. Using this lineage, Edward claimed to be the legal heir to the French throne. But the French nobles and King Philip VI immediately rejected this claim. They pointed to the Salic Law, which prohibited women and their male descendants from claiming the French throne. Ah, my friends, this rejection wounded Edward III's pride. Not only did he refuse to recognize Philip VI's claim to the throne, but he also saw it as a slight against England and his own rights. His anger grew like an ember. He knew he couldn't achieve his goals through peaceful means. Thus, Edward decided to draw his sword. But wisdom is knowing when to use the sword, isn't it? Instead of launching a direct assault on France, Edward began with economic and political maneuvers. He sought allies in the Duchy of Flanders, as Flanders was a crucial partner in England's wool trade and a land trying to distance itself from French influence. The people and nobles of Flanders had begun to sympathize with the English king, as their economic prosperity was tightly linked to the English wool trade. Edward leveraged this support to build a strong front against France. Trade relations and diplomacy were the initial steps in Edward's war preparations. Of course, this was just the beginning. Edward's strategic intelligence, military strength, and grand ambitions were creating an unstoppable force against France. However, King Philip VI of France didn't ignore this. Philip carefully observed all of England's moves and prepared to counter them. Both kings knew that a confrontation was now inevitable. And finally, that moment arrived. The year 1337 was about to become a pivotal year in history. Edward officially declared war against King Philip VI of France. But this wasn't just a declaration of war, my dear friends. It marked the beginning of an epic conflict that would last nearly a century. In 1337, at a grand assembly in his royal palace, Edward made a proclamation that reverberated across all of Europe. Edward III, King of England, claimed the title of King of France and all rights to this land as its rightful heir. These words echoed not only in the lands of England and France, but throughout the royal courts of Europe. Everyone was left stunned. Edward's bold declaration was like the herald of a storm. His allies in the Duchy of Flanders were thrilled by this announcement, as weakening France was crucial for Flanders' independence and prosperity. However, France would not accept England's claim. King Philip VI was preparing his army and allies for war. Until now, he hadn't underestimated his enemy. But this time he understood Edward's seriousness and determination better. Edward III began gathering troops against France. The English army was not just made up of ordinary soldiers, it included the bravest knights, warriors, and mercenaries of the time. Across England, young knights and soldiers volunteered for the war, eager to prove themselves. Each of them had in their hearts the story of England's victory and their own glory. Edward's strategic brilliance was evident not only on the battlefield but also in the military preparations. With well-trained archers, famous longbows, and armored knights, he was preparing a force to challenge the French. And so, my dear friends, in 1337, the tension between these two great nations turned into a war decided by swords and lances. Edward's bold declaration was not just a military assault on France, but also an insult and a challenge. But remember, war is not only won on the battlefields, but also in minds and hearts. Edward's declaration of war united England for a single purpose: to subdue France and validate his claims with blood and fire. Thus, the epic struggle between the two kings began on French soil. Blood and tears would determine the fate of both nations. The first spark of the 100 Years' War had been struck. Are you ready? Because the true story of the war is about to begin. My dear listeners, here we are, arriving at the time when the first sparks of war were ignited and the winds began to shift. A time when both sides were watching each other closely, planning in silence, and intrigue was rife. Let's take a look at the strategic moves and preparations of England and France before this long and bloody war. But that's not all. Internal conflicts and weaknesses within the French kingdom were also among the reasons that triggered this great war. Everything is so interconnected that it feels as though fate itself wrote this war. At the outset, King Edward III of England's maneuvers were like moves on a grand chessboard. But this was no mere game, my dear friends. Edward was a great strategist. He knew that defeating France's seemingly invincible forces required more than just swords and armor. To win this war, one first needed to identify weaknesses and scrutinize the enemy down to the finest detail. Unfortunately, the French kingdom was struggling with internal turmoil and political divisions at the time. Edward, of course, was well aware of France's weaknesses. Particularly in northern France, many feudal lords were deeply dissatisfied with King Philip VI. The feudal lords, while trying to protect their own independence, were constantly shaking France's central authority. Normandy, Gascony, Flanders. These regions occasionally saw uprisings, conflicts, and even rebellions. Although France appeared to be a powerful kingdom, it was actually boiling like a volcano inside. Edward decided to use this volcano to his advantage. He had formed an alliance with Flanders, but that wasn't enough. In his view, he needed a much larger plan to exploit France's weaknesses. He sent his diplomats to the discontented lords in France, making secret agreements to weaken France from within. English gold further empowered the opposition voices within France. This gold ended up in the pockets of knights, merchants, and spies alike. Each gold coin was like a stone laid in preparation for France's internal collapse. Meanwhile, the situation in France was chaotic. Many nobles did not accept King Philip VI's central authority and wanted to act independently in the territories they governed, as if they were small kingdoms themselves. Although Philip tried to preserve the unity of his kingdom, these uprisings and disputes grew every day. The Duchy of Flanders, in particular, was England's trade partner and protested France's policies at every opportunity. Because Flanders merchants depended on English wool, they preferred to side with England. Philip's only option was to suppress these rebellions and present a strong stance against England. However, dear friends, Philip faced another problem. Even within the French army, there were different factions. Knights raised their swords for their own interests, and secret agreements were made among local lords. It was uncertain which knight was loyal to the king and which might defect to England. This uncertainty brought France closer to civil war. Edward saw all this as an opportunity. He wanted to gain an advantage not only militarily but also psychologically and diplomatically. He knew France's weaknesses and set out to exploit these weaknesses through his strategic moves. Edward decided to immediately use the weapon of trade and economics. He stopped wool exports to France, which led to a severe economic crisis in Flanders. But this crisis made Flanders even more dependent on England because they relied on English wool. My friends, this was England's first major strategic move. Philip, in response, imposed an embargo on English goods as part of this commercial war. But this only deepened the enmity. Edward's second major move was to build an army, but not just any army. He gathered mercenaries, archers, and knights from the European continent. He recruited warriors from regions like Burgundy, Gascony, and Flanders. He especially planned to use England's famous longbowmen as his greatest asset against France. These archers were England's most skilled and deadly soldiers. With their longbows, they rained death upon their enemies from afar. On the other hand, France did not merely watch England's moves. Philip VI began preparing to create his own strategy. He attempted to establish a naval blockade against England, but this plan was thwarted by England's rapidly moving fleets. The French Navy struggled to counter English dominance at sea. But Philip did not give up. He began staging small skirmishes and attacks to increase pressure on England at every opportunity. But these attacks only fueled England's determination and led Edward to seek a larger war. At that time, a major uprising broke out in northern France. The merchants and peasants of Flanders revolted due to the economic crisis and high taxes. Philip sent his army to suppress the rebellion, but this disrupted his strategic plans. While part of the French army was occupied with quelling the rebellion on its own soil, England was poised to take advantage of the situation. And so, dear friends, while both sides made their moves in this period that resembled a strategic chess game, both kingdoms were trying to gain power by exploiting each other's weaknesses. But remember, who would win this war would be determined not only by strategy but also by patience and courage. Edward's moves were eroding France from within, while Philip was struggling to maintain the unity of his kingdom. Both sides' soldiers risked their lives to carry out their leaders' plans. But know this, dear listeners, the real winds of war had not yet begun to blow. The blood shed on the battlefields, the heroics performed, and the traps set would determine the outcome of this war. The war was just beginning, and who would emerge victorious was in the hands of the gods and fate. Be ready, because the real story of the war is just beginning. Ah, my dear friends, let me tell you the story of a major naval battle. This story isn't just about a sea battle, it's a turning point, a legend, an event that changed the course of an era, the Battle of Sluys. Yes, within that name lies a battle cry rising from the depths of the seas. This battle, one of the most critical moments of the 100 Years' War, changed the course of the conflict between England and France forever. Get ready, because we're about to dive deep into the details, strategies, and outcomes of this sea battle. The year is 1340. Tensions between France and England had built up like a volcano ready to erupt. King Edward III of England was preparing for a major assault on French territory. But to make this attack successful, it was crucial to reach France by sea and establish dominance there. Back then, control of the seas directly influenced the outcome of land battles. And that's why this naval battle at Sluys was a critical moment that would determine the future of both countries. Now imagine a battle breaking out in the middle of the sea. On opposite shores, two armies, giant ships, and soldiers armed with spears and bows are setting the rhythm of the battle. England's powerful fleet looms over the sea like a shadow. Edward III had spent years perfecting his naval strategy. Leading the English fleet were Admiral Hugh Courtenay, renowned for his strategies and experts in naval warfare. This fleet was made up not only of warships but also of experienced sailors. France, on the other hand, wasn't exactly ready for this battle. King Philip VI's navy wasn't equipped to handle the English forces. Philip's fleet was made up of many small old ships, which would prove ineffective in this crucial confrontation. France's shortcomings in naval warfare only strengthened England's hand. Sluys became the focal point of the struggle for naval supremacy between these two powers. Then came the big day. June 24th, 1340, the day a series of fierce clashes began off the coast of Sluys. The sounds of the sea turned into a deadly symphony of spears and arrows. The English had expertly positioned their archers. These archers pierced through the French ships one by one. This tactic, aimed at preventing the enemy from advancing and gaining superiority, proved highly effective. The French ships struggled to withstand the deadly arrows of the English archers. The French fleet couldn't counter the English attacks and suffered a massive defeat within a few hours. The results of the battle solidified English dominance at sea. This victory allowed England to control French sea routes and gain a significant strategic advantage. France experienced a severe morale blow from this battle, and England's dominance in naval warfare continued for a long time. The importance of the Battle of Sluys wasn't just about a victory, it was also a strategic turning point. England's control of the seas forced France into land battles, which directly impacted the course of the war. France's reliance on naval power weakened, and England gained a major advantage in future assaults on French territory. Sluys represented not just a battle but the beginning of a maritime empire's dominance. However, the true significance of this victory went beyond just naval success. With the victory at Sluys, England also solidified its psychological edge over France. The French struggled to come to terms with this huge defeat, leading to a drop in morale in the later stages of the war. The seas of Sluys were not just a battlefield but also an arena that set the psychological and strategic tone of the war. So, my dear friends, the significance and outcomes of the Battle of Sluys had a profound impact that encompassed not only the military but also the psychological and strategic aspects of the war. This victory, shining like a beacon in the midst of the seas, gave England a major advantage in the century-long conflict. And this victory reminded us once again of how critical control of the seas and strategic planning can be. My dear friends, close your eyes for a moment and take a journey deep into history. We're focusing on one of the most exciting chapters of the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Crecy. This battle isn't just a victory, it's a turning point, a peak of military strategy, an event that determined the fate of an era. The year is 1346. The conflicts between England and France had become increasingly complex. King Edward III of England launched a major military campaign to gain dominance over French territory. This battle, about to take place near the village of Crecy in France, was set to leave a deep mark on history. Let's dive into the details, depths, and outcomes of this remarkable event. One of the legendary aspects of the Battle of Crecy was the display of English strategic brilliance and, in particular, the superiority of their archers. King Edward III of England had a well-trained and effective army for this battle against the French. However, the greatest strength of this army came from its archers. England's skilled archers were about to achieve a historic success. When the battle began, the French faced the English off the coast of Crecy. The French army, led by King Philip VI and a host of noble and military leaders, was grand in scale. But the English were prepared and determined. The longbows possessed by the English, practically a marvel of military engineering, became the deadly adversary of their foes. As the English prepared for battle, they used the advantage of the terrain to develop a perfect defensive strategy. The archers were strategically placed and positioned with deadly precision. These archers unleashed chaos and death upon the enemy. The French knights were left vulnerable to the lethal attack of the English archers. The massive collapse of the French forces, due to the overwhelming impact of the archers, shifted the course of the battle. Despite having a large army, the French were helpless against the strategic superiority of the English. England's victory in this battle was not just a military triumph, but also a symbol of strategic success. The results of the Battle of Crecy hold an important place in history books. This victory gave England a significant moral and strategic advantage for future assaults on French territory. The French had to deal with internal strife and morale issues after this great defeat, leading to a long-lasting disruption in their military and political structure. However, the effects of Crecy were not only military but also had psychological and cultural dimensions. The victory changed the balance of power in Europe and showcased England's military prowess to a broad audience. The French, faced with this major defeat, had to reassess their war strategies and develop new tactics to alter the course of the conflict. My dear friends, the Battle of Crecy is one of the most significant moments in military history. This battle represents not just a victory but also strategy, bravery, and the symbol of a shifting era. The success led by English archers shines like a star in the depths of history, reminding us once again of the importance of war strategies, psychological factors, and military tactics. The great battle fought on Crecy's grounds will forever hold its place in the annals of history as a vivid example of how complex and impactful wars can be. My dear friends, it's time to share with you how war is not just a fight but also an art filled with intelligence, strategy, and innovation. Now we will embark on a historical journey to deeply explore the military strategies and innovations surrounding the Battle of Crecy. At this critical moment in the Hundred Years' War, the innovations England brought to the battlefield represented a revolutionary change in military strategy. As you stepped onto the battlefield, you found yourself in a completely different world. Everything was shaped by an innovation that shattered the traditional understanding of war in that era. The army commanded by King Edward III of England was full of tactical innovations that changed the dynamics of the battle. At the forefront of these innovations was the role of the longbow on the battlefield. In traditional wars, heavy armor and swords of knights were dominant, but the English radically changed this perception. The English included a group of archers, skilled in the use of longbows in the battle. These archers became a critical factor in determining the outcome of the war. Known for their high accuracy and effective range, these archers could penetrate the front lines, shields, and armor of the enemy. While their enemies tried to defend themselves, the arrows of the archers rained down on them like a deadly downpour. This was a major shift in war tactics, as previously, it seemed almost impossible to penetrate the thick armor of the enemy. However, this innovation by the English archers directly influenced the outcome of the war. Moving like war machines, the archers inflicted heavy damage on their enemies and ensured England's strategic superiority. Another innovation was related to the deployment on the battlefield. During the war, the English used their strategic advantages to make the area as suitable as possible for battle. The positioning of the English army was planned to restrict the movement of the French and draw them into weak spots. The longbow archers, from the early stages of the battle, continually harassed the enemy, impacting their morale. These strategies were not just signs of a single battle but also indicated a shift in the military mindset of an era. In previous wars, especially those dominated by knights, strategies were generally based on close combat and sword and shield fights. But at Crecy, the English, using the range advantage of the longbows and the high accuracy of the archers, managed to neutralize their enemies from a distance. Another notable aspect of this battle was the French's surprise in the face of the English's innovative tactics. The French, who were fighting with traditional methods, were unprepared for the modern military strategies of the English. This was another key factor that changed the course of the war and paved the way for England's victory. To summarize, the Battle of Crecy is a testament to how quickly and fundamentally military strategies and tactics can change. The English determined the fate of the war with the innovative advantages brought by their longbow archers and the effective strategies they applied on the battlefield. This is considered a turning point in military history and remains one of the most significant moments in the history of military strategy. My dear friends, this evolutionary process of war shows us not only the importance of military strategies, but also the critical role of innovation and the use of intelligence. The innovative approaches in the Battle of Crécy tell us how war has become a science and how military strategies have been shaped throughout history. This fundamental change reveals that wars rely not only on strength, but also on intelligence and strategy. My dear friends, today we will journey deep into history, beyond the shadows of the 100 Years' War, to uncover how the Black Plague affected the course of the war, the drastic changes in England and France's military strategies, and the temporary lulls in the conflict. This is not just a story of a war, but a tale of how an entire era and the fates of its people were transformed. The year is 1348. Europe is stepping into perhaps one of the darkest periods in its history. The Black Plague emerges as a horrifying pandemic, spreading death and destruction to every corner of the continent. This deadly plague ravages cities and villages across Europe, bringing life to a near standstill. The impact of the Black Plague was profound, not just on individual lives, but also on wars and military strategies. England and France's war strategies were greatly influenced by the massive losses and social changes brought on by the plague. The plague drastically reduced the number of soldiers in both countries. As cities and villages faced devastating losses, with half the population succumbing to the disease, many soldiers also perished. This forced both countries to rebuild their armies. The significant drop in soldier numbers led to the development of new battlefield strategies. During this period, England began to adopt more flexible and dynamic strategies to cope with the uncertainties brought by the war. The English military shifted its focus to smaller, yet effective and well-trained units to handle the challenges posed by the Black Plague. To balance the reduced number of soldiers, the English introduced innovations in warfare tactics and technology. For instance, the prominence of longbowmen during this era was a reflection of these changes. France, on the other hand, faced severe economic and social turmoil due to the plague. With a dwindling population and increasing poverty, France struggled to cope with the war's challenges. During this period, French military strategies became more defensive. The French aimed to buy time to regroup their forces and regain their former glory, which led to a temporary pause in the war. This temporary lull allowed both countries to make fundamental changes in their strategies. After the Black Plague, England developed several tactical innovations to maintain an advantage on the battlefield. These included more flexible and dynamic war strategies, small but effective units, and the use of new military technologies. For France, this period provided an opportunity to reorganize and prepare its military forces. The country adopted a more defense-oriented approach to its military strategies and looked for new ways to tackle the economic difficulties caused by the plague. The temporary pause not only changed the course of the war, but also deeply impacted the strategic thinking of both countries. The brief peace between England and France was seen as a period of rebuilding, where both sides had the chance to review their strategies and strengthen their forces for future conflicts. The Black Plague disrupted the natural course of the war. A nation's strength on the battlefield is largely dependent on its number of soldiers and war capacity. However, the plague significantly reduced the number of soldiers in both countries, leading to major changes in war strategies. Despite the reduced number of troops, England developed new techniques to maintain its effectiveness in war. The use of longbowmen and the more effective deployment of infantry units were among the key innovations of this period. The English made various strategic moves to try and turn the tide of the war in their favor. France, meanwhile, looked for opportunities to rebuild and strengthen its army during this temporary lull. Internal conflicts and economic difficulties within the country led the war to take a more defensive turn during this time. The French adopted more defensive strategies during this challenging period caused by the plague, taking various measures to regroup their strength for the coming years. This led to a temporary halt in the war and significant changes in the war strategies of both countries. The temporary pause in the war allowed both nations to reassess their strategies. This difficult period brought by the Black Plague gave England and France the chance to review their war strategies, restructure their armies, and reframe their strategic plans. During this time, England developed various innovations to increase its power on the battlefield and took significant steps to prepare for future wars. France, on the other hand, used this temporary lull in the war to rebuild its army and to strengthen its war strategies on a firmer foundation. This temporary halt influenced not only the war but also the course of history for both countries. Seeing how the difficulties brought by the Black Plague and the war led to major changes throughout history prompts us to delve deeper into this period and better understand the historical process. These events reflect crucial periods that highlight the complexity and historical importance of the 100 Years' War. The changes in the course of the war caused by the Black Plague had long-term consequences for both England and France, creating significant impacts in the period following the war. So, dear friends, let us now continue to explore these critical events more deeply and understand how the 100 Years' War underwent a transformation. My dear friends, as we flip through the pages of history, we often see how a city or a port can change the course of a war. This story takes place in the heart of the 100 Years' War, right in the middle of the fierce struggle between England and France. Calais, at the height of its historical significance, holding the fate of the war in its hands. By the year 1347, Calais had become strategically vital. At this critical juncture in the war between England and France, control over Calais held immense value. Situated on the northern coast of France, this city and port, directly under English control, had become a key point that could influence the outcome of the conflict. By capturing this city, the English would not only gain control over France's northern coast, but also strengthen England's political and economic influence in Europe. There were profound reasons behind England targeting this crucial point. Calais provided a foothold for England on the European continent, serving as a launchpad for further advances into France. The city was of great importance to the English as a military base and a strategic center. Furthermore, capturing Calais would allow England to establish a permanent presence on French soil, thereby partially reducing France's strategic depth. However, taking control of Calais was not just a military achievement, it was also an economic victory. Controlling the port allowed England to command the major trade routes in northern Europe. Calais was situated at a point where lucrative trade routes passed, giving England a significant economic advantage. The city was not just a port but also a major trade center, making it the heart of England's economic strategy. The loss of this strategic point forced France to thoroughly reconsider its war strategies. By capturing Calais, the English had significantly weakened France's defensive line and increased their influence on the northern French coast. The capture of Calais became a turning point in the war, solidifying England's strategic superiority. But this victory also brought a huge burden for England. Maintaining the constant defense of the city and port posed a major military and logistical challenge. The English would have to defend Calais continually, bringing a series of difficulties that impacted other aspects of the war. Calais remained a strategic asset for England, but it also opened the door to ongoing conflict and strategic planning. My dear friends, this event, which is perhaps too profound and meaningful to be captured in a few lines of history books, shows us that wars are shaped not just by soldiers but also by strategy, economics, and politics. The capture of Calais marked a moment that strengthened England's victories and deeply affected France's war strategies. Now we will delve deeper into the details of this significant event to understand how it altered the course of the war and how both countries battled over this strategic point. Dear history enthusiasts, In this chapter of our historical journey, we're diving into the internal conflicts and uprisings in France during the Hundred Years' War. These events not only disrupted France's internal balance but also had a profound impact on the course of the war. So let's dive into this complex and dynamic period and witness how France's internal struggles shaped the direction of the war. By the mid-14th century, when the war broke out, France's internal politics were rocked by a series of complex issues. Under the reign of King Charles VI, Charles the Beloved, the country faced not only external enemies but also internal strife. During this period, France was in a state of great social and political instability. There was widespread dissatisfaction among the people, peasants and townsfolk alike, which eventually grew into major revolts. One of the most significant internal conflicts of the time was the power struggle among the feudal lords in France. The power imbalances created by the feudal system led to constant conflicts between local lords. These struggles often resulted in regional uprisings and even armed conflicts. While trying to control the people and resources within their own territories, these feudal lords also clashed with the central authority of the kingdom. These conflicts weakened the internal governance of the French kingdom and negatively impacted its ability to fight as a united force. Another important internal conflict was the uprisings that broke out in France's southern regions. In the south, especially in the Provence and Languedoc regions, there was significant unrest among the peasants and townspeople living under the rule of feudal lords and local authorities. This unrest led regional leaders and nobles to openly rebel against the central authority of the kingdom. These uprisings not only strained the kingdom's military power, but also shook the country's economic structure. The revolts in southern France caused resources and soldiers to be spread thin during the war, which became another major factor influencing the direction of the conflict. And of course, another reflection of these internal struggles was the tension between the northern and southern parts of France. The devastation brought by the war in the north further fueled unrest in the south. The tensions between these two regions led to an increase in internal conflicts and further weakened central authority. Small-scale rebellions that broke out in towns and villages further weakened France's cohesion during the war. The effects of these internal conflicts and uprisings on the course of the war were quite profound. France's internal instability contributed to England gaining a stronger position in the war. The internal revolts and feudal conflicts drained France's military resources and morale, reducing its capacity to counter England's strategic moves. Dear friends, these internal conflicts and uprisings throughout history show just how much they can affect a country's balance during times of war and peace. France's period of internal turmoil helps us understand the complexity and multidimensional impacts of war. It reminds us once again of the role internal unrest can play in a nation's struggle against external enemies and how these conflicts can change the course of wars. Now, as we delve deeper into the details of this turbulent period, we will continue to explore how France's internal conflicts and uprisings impacted the bigger picture of the Hundred Years' War. Dear history enthusiasts, today I'm going to tell you the tale of France's revival and its journey back to power from the dusty pages of history. After the dark days of the Hundred Years' War, a figure emerged who would shape France's destiny: Charles V. The rise of this great king and the strategic changes he implemented transformed not only France's internal dynamics but also the entire course of the war. Let's dive into the details of this incredible transformation together. At a time when France's internal turmoil and external threats had reached a peak, Charles V ascended to the throne. Taking power in 1364, Charles V was tasked with resolving the internal and external issues that had been hanging over the country like a dark cloud. After years of ongoing wars, internal revolts, and administrative difficulties, Charles's accession to the throne shone like a beacon of hope. However, the challenges facing Charles V were not limited to the massive military power of England. Internal unrest and regional uprisings also posed serious threats. Charles V's first steps were to create a comprehensive strategy to mitigate the effects of the war and internal turmoil. This strategy primarily included military and economic reforms. Charles reorganized his army, establishing an effective and disciplined military force. During this process, structural and strategic reforms in the French army significantly enhanced its ability to effectively counter the English. Charles V's military reforms allowed France to operate more effectively and organized on the battlefield. Notably, long-range archers and infantry provided a crucial advantage against English war strategies. But Charles V's strategic changes were not limited to the military sphere. Addressing internal revolts and unrest was also crucial. Charles made efforts to establish peace in various regions of the country by negotiating with local feudal lords and rebels. He took several steps to reduce the imbalances introduced by the feudal system and strengthen the central authority. These efforts contributed to France's recovery both socially and politically. Charles V's methods for dealing with internal revolts played a critical role in the French kingdom's resurgence. Instead of just suppressing the uprisings, Charles used both military and diplomatic approaches to address the root causes of the unrest. This approach not only suppressed the revolts but also contributed to the creation of a long-term peace environment. France's efforts to regain strength were combined with Charles V's successful internal reforms. During this period, France's economic situation also began to improve. Reforms in agriculture and trade brought economic stability and enabled the country to gather the resources needed for the war. Charles V achieved great success in strengthening the country's economic structure and ensuring France remained financially robust during the conflict. At the same time, France's international standing gradually began to improve. Charles V's strategic moves and internal reforms helped France become a more effective player in the war. Negotiations with England resulted in agreements and diplomatic actions that strengthened France's position. These diplomatic successes helped France gain a superior position in the war. Dear history friends, Charles V's rise to power and the subsequent strategic changes set the course for France during the 100 Years' War. His leadership in the face of internal uprisings and unrest not only ensured France's internal stability but also altered the course of the war. This period stands as a turning point in the dusty pages of history. Charles V's great achievement serves as a key example of how France's revival and the balance in the complex arena of the war were affected. Now we'll dive deeper into other significant events of this era and explore France's impact on the course of the war. Get ready, because there are many more undiscovered details and stories waiting for us in this fascinating period of history. Dear friends, we've reached a turning point in our historical journey. Today we'll focus on the Treaty of Brittany, a crucial milestone in the complex and painful process of the 100 Years' War. This treaty had profound consequences for both England and France and altered the course of the war. Let's explore the details of this treaty and the complexities of the subsequent temporary peace period. Signed on May 8, 1360, this treaty emerged as an effort to ease the weariness of the war. The Treaty of Brittany was aimed at providing a long-term peace between England and France. However, it was more than just a peace agreement. It also showed how tensions between the two countries were temporarily eased. One notable aspect of the treaty was France's payment of a large ransom to England. This provided England with significant financial gain and eased the financial burden of the war. Additionally, the lands ceded by France were a crucial part of the agreement. These included strategic areas such as Aquitaine and its surrounding regions. The transfer of these lands to English control provided the English with important military and commercial advantages. However, the reality behind the Treaty of Brittany was that the peace it established was quite fragile. The temporary peace achieved between the parties did not resolve many issues and disagreements. Tensions between England and France continued even after the treaty. Diplomatic relations between the two countries became more complicated right after the treaty. In France, the impact of the treaty sparked significant social and political debate. The French people questioned the heavy financial burden and the lost territories imposed by the treaty. This situation led to a resurgence of internal unrest and revolts. Additionally, there were criticisms and internal conflicts within the French royal family regarding the treaty's outcomes. These internal conflicts complicated France's post-war recovery and created instability in the country's domestic politics. In England, the treaty was initially seen as a major victory. However, over time, dissatisfaction with the treaty's terms emerged among the English government and people. Some groups in England argued that the treaty was insufficient and that they should demand more from France. This situation increased political tensions within England and fueled uncertainties in relations with France. While the temporary peace period anticipated by the treaty offered an opportunity for both England and France, doubts about the durability of this peace remained. Disagreements between the parties led to various issues during the implementation of the treaty. For example, disputes over land redistribution and ransom payments occasionally caused conflicts. This demonstrated how fragile the temporary peace was, and that tensions between the two countries could flare up again at any moment. Following the Treaty of Bretigny, relations between England and France became more complex. The temporary peace period reflected both countries' efforts to achieve strategic goals and resolve internal issues. However, the durability of the peace envisioned by the treaty was not achieved for various reasons, setting the stage for new conflicts. Dear friends, the terms and consequences of the Treaty of Bretigny show us how complex and changeable international relations can be throughout history. Temporary peace periods not only end wars but also reveal how tensions and disagreements between parties can persist. The events of this period offer us an important lesson on the complexity of war and the fragility of peace. Now, are we ready to move on to the next chapter of our historical journey? We'll delve deeper into the events that followed this complex period and explore how relations between France and England evolved. Get ready, as this fascinating period of history will lead us to many more surprising details and stories. Dear friends, let's take a look at this fascinating chapter of history. The Treaty of Bretigny, which brought a temporary peace, surprisingly didn't lead to long-lasting tranquility. The collapse of this peace highlighted the deep tensions and conflicts of interest between the two countries. Let's explore why the peace between England and France broke down and the complexities behind this collapse. Although the peace between England and France was established through the Treaty of Bretigny, it was quite fragile due to each country's unique interests and internal issues. Shortly after the treaty was signed, the first conflicts between the two countries revealed that this temporary peace wasn't built on solid ground. During the treaty negotiations, France made several concessions to England, but these concessions were far from satisfactory for the French. France's internal problems made the process even more complicated. Power struggles within the royal family, regional uprisings, and economic difficulties made it hard for France to bear the burdens of the treaty. King Charles VI's weakness and the internal conflicts behind him made France as a whole quite unstable. In England, there was constant doubt about whether the peace would last. England didn't find the land and political advantages granted by the treaty sufficient. Specifically, the need to make the gains in French territory permanent became a topic of debate in England's domestic and foreign policies. King Edward III and his successors expressed a desire for further expansion in French territories. This desire led England to apply diplomatic and military pressure to tighten the terms of the peace and acquire more land. Additionally, difficulties in implementing the treaty led to the breakdown of peace. There were constant disputes over land division, ransom payments, and other conditions. Particularly, the management of the lands acquired by England and the disputes over France's sovereignty over these lands increased tensions between the two countries. Internal conflicts in France not only affected the country itself but also had an impact on its relations with England. Disagreements among French nobles and regional leaders weakened the central authority of the kingdom, which in turn increased England's pressure on France. These internal conflicts in France led England to apply more pressure on French territories and establish a stronger military presence there. Another significant reason for the breakdown of peace was that both countries' economic and military needs went beyond the limits set by the treaty. While France was trying to alleviate the devastating effects of the war, England was seeking to capitalize on the opportunities the war presented. These opposing goals made it impossible to maintain the peace between the two countries effectively. In conclusion, the peace between England and France quickly deteriorated due to both countries' internal and external politics, economic conditions, and military strategies. The temporary peace couldn't heal the deep wounds of the war, leading to a resurgence of conflict. This breakdown once again showed how complex and unstable the relationship between the two countries was. This period in history reminds us that peace can be just a beginning, and that lasting tranquility requires deeper and more solid foundations. Dear friends, we've explored the depths of history and closely observed the fragile nature of peace. Now, are we ready to discover the developments that followed and how the war reignited? There are many more stories and lessons waiting for us in these intriguing corners of the past. Get ready, because our journey through history continues.